Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Kierkegaard was saying that, well, we got to get beyond that. You know, we got to find a way to be an individual, and then out of that individuality, we would find a way to relate to a larger group that we might call a community.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Sister Geraldine Nowak, a pastoral associate at St. Ignatius Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections is community life, intimacy, and expectations. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Geraldine, I'd like to talk a little bit about the question of community. I mean, that's a rich and powerful word, and I'm thinking that it has to do with people trying to deal with the impersonal character of our modern world. Way back in the 19th century, the philosopher Soren Kierkegaard started analyzing the modern world, and he said that people were so much a member of a crowd. He used the word crowd to define the way of understanding how we were interacting. In other words, there wasn't personal interactions. People were sort of going along with the crowd. People were not thinking for themselves. They were involved in a lot of peer pressure and so on. I suppose you would say that it was more of a collective notion of life. And then that Kierkegaard was saying that, well, we got to get beyond that. You know, we got to find a way to be an individual, and then out of that individuality, we would find a way to relate to a larger group that we might call a community. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about this impersonal character of human existence these days. And to see if we can't get a feel for that. I'm thinking if people go into a hamburger place, to McDonald's or Burger King or something, I mean, you don't have a big choice of how you do things. I mean, you don't interact and say, well, let's try this or that. There's a set sort of bureaucratic way of doing things. The sociologist Max Weber talked about it in terms of the iron cage, that the modern bureaucratic world was like an iron cage that imprisoned us. Well, I don't know. Do you want to do anything with that?
Well, you seem to be saying something that there's something out there that's crying out for something that's more. And when you say that, I think of when I ride down the streets of the city, and many times, regardless of what it is, a church or a show or something, the importance of the word home. Many times people will say, come home to, and it can be anything. It can be anything from, some come home to a product or come home to a church. And I'm zeroing in on the word home because I think another definition is that we feel most at home when we are somewhere where we are valued and where we feel comfortable. And that word home, I've heard people say, I feel at home with you, or I feel at home there. So just in the media and the advertising media, where many times that becomes the lure, and what it says to me is that, gee, we really do have a strong need to sort of find that, to counteract that impersonal. I'm thinking along that, it prompts that thought, and also another thought that precisely at this point in time is different from the past, that need is there, that hunger is there, because in the past we had such things as we were more together as a family and as an extended family, as a neighborhood and as a church. And again, with the society that we're in, the great mobility, it's very common for many families to be scattered all over. And they find themselves then in the situation and being scattered from their home to relocate and to regroup together. And so I think the need is there, the hunger is there, and it's certainly quite evident to me that people are looking for that place to feel at home, and that is occurring in several places at this point in time.
I'm thinking of the phrase, the hunger for community, and that might set that up. I mean, if you don't have the kind of face-to-face relationships you're looking for, if you feel uprooted and you have to move a lot, I think there does become out of the human heart a hunger for community and a hunger to be with people that you share values with, or to belong to some grouping that really has something that's worthwhile to work for, and so on. I think that might be a way of saying it. At least I believe there's a lot of people in the modern world who feel that way. They feel as though a lot of their life is superficial, that nothing of depth is going on. I mean, you'll talk to women who are working very hard in the home to raise their children, but they're interacting with children all day. And maybe their husband comes home and he's not very communicative. And therefore, she has a hunger for deeper sharing. to be able to talk at a deeper kind of level. Life feels superficial to her, or infantile, or stultifying in one way or another, and you can almost feel that thirst for something more than, as you suggested before, which we might call intimacy. You know, there's a hunger for intimacy that maybe only community might be able to provide.
I have just a little difficulty with the word intimacy, and that I guess in this reference I'm understanding it as that place where one feels at home, that there are those common values. The word always bothers me again because I think the secular world, the media, always adapts something sexual to that connotation, and I guess I'm understanding it, you know, sexual in its best sense, but also intimacy, that place where one feels at home. So in the example of the lady that you talked about is at home, there is that hunger for intimacy, but the type of intimacy where she's relating with peers, where she can go somewhere beyond her home environment, talk with adults, share those common values with maybe other women or a mixed group, and then somehow or other come back to that home enriched, come back to, let's say, her husband who comes home or whatever. And I guess that's what I'm understanding, that there's the great hunger for.
Okay, so what you want to do really is broaden out the term intimacy and say that, how would we begin to describe that more completely? It would mean that we would be people who are able to be intimate with one another. We'd say that they could communicate well together, that they would have a sense of trust for one another, that they would have certain shared values perhaps, that they would be able to talk about their deeper feelings. Aren't those the things we begin to associate with intimacy? Of course, I mean, we don't want to rule out the sexual realm, as you said. I mean, then the sexual intimacy would become one aspect of a larger intimacy. In fact, when you look at the culture as a whole, probably one of the problems is that people often want sexual intimacy without the emotional, imaginative, psychological, intellectual intimacy that might be possible. That it would, one way we would say it maybe is that sexual intimacy ought to fit into some sort of larger framework.
Or that sexual intimacy only becomes enhanced and becomes the result of this other intimacy that takes place.
Right. So we could then say that in the culture there is a great hunger for intimate relationships. I don't think there's much doubt about that. Not that everyone needs them. I mean, I think we got to recognize some people have an opposite problem, where some people would say, I got more intimacy than I need. You know, I got a lot of close friends, and I have a loving wife or husband, and I'm really close to my kids, and they confide in me, and so on. And such a person might say, hey, I got enough of this. I'm not out searching for intimacy. What I've got to do is manage the intimate relationships I have to make sure that they don't devolve into something superficial, or that I got enough time to deal with the various intimate relationships I have. I think we have to recognize that there's at least some people who find themselves in that position.
And I think that's a tension well acknowledged. I'm a member of a religious community, and I believe that, you know, community is always the goal and the ideal, but that probably what most of us will have said in our living situations is that we struggled toward community. One of those examples being that sometime in a given group, depending upon how many are there, the number is important, but there may be out of a given group, depending upon the number, one person may have the need for a lot of intimacy, and the other person may have another, you know, the situation that you pinpoint. It creates a tension. And basically, I guess one of those common things that help create that community is if dialogue could be present, and that we could, you know, talk about, if I find myself in a given group, we really do have to explore together what are our expectations regarding the closeness of this group. And from my lived experience, I believe that we all have the need for intimate relationships, and for some of us, that happens with a group of people we could be living with, or it has to happen outside that group. And then that takes on different nuances in the way we relate with groups.
Yeah, a lot of good points in there, Geraldine, that I don't want to miss. I mean, one of the first questions it's raising in my mind, it has to do with how we define community. Now, if we're talking about community, what is it that we really mean? And one thing it seems to me is that it does define an ideal kind of relationship. In other words, the word community is a rich and beautiful word. It speaks to us of an ideal towards which we'd like to move, it seems to me. That is, where there would be mutuality and harmony and equality and communication and dialogue and so on. It speaks about relationships that really work, where we respect one another and so on. So in its broadest context, I suppose, we'd say what we'd like is the whole human family to be a community. Everybody walking on this globe, we'd say it would be great if we could live in those kind of peaceful, harmonious relationships. We don't have that. We got nationalism and wars and difficulties and religious groupings that don't get along and so on. But ideally, that would be the greatest community. In fact, I suppose in our Christian understanding of things, we say, well, that's what heaven would be, in a sense, is one large community in this sense of mutuality and sharing and reciprocity and so on. But besides that, we've got that notion of community, which is extremely broad, in fact, universal and ideal. Then we've got our other smaller groupings where we sort of approximate that, where we exist in families that are sort of small communities, or we belong to a parish that is a community, or at least fosters community life, or people like you that belong to a religious order that's a community. Or maybe some people find their community like a support group of people that they get together with. They're friends, and they can talk about important things, and they get along well. Some of them are more structured, like people have support groups, like divorced people might form a community with other divorced people, or alcoholics feel that sense of community with the others that they attend the meetings with and so on. So what am I saying is that the word community slides. In other words, it doesn't seem possible to give one clear definition, but when we hear the word, we think positively. It's a beautiful kind of idea of how we'd like to group ourselves and how we'd like to relate to one another, and yet we have to do it in a limited way with all of our faults and failings, and figure out how to make those work. Might be one way of trying to get at this question of what community really means.
I like all the examples that you use of community, and again, the lure that's out there, or the longing that we have. And in the way my mind works, I have to think of those groups that have that and those groups that don't. And I guess I think in terms of groups that we might call primary groups. And that's where all those wonderful qualities are that you just explained, and that's where we feel most at home. And then I think there are those other groups that are called secondary groups. And in those groups, for example, there are certain characteristics. Basic to both of them are relationships. That's a given. And in the primary relationship, I think there's the total acceptance. Acceptance of each other. It's sort of non-transferable. Like if, let's say, if I were in a group with you and somehow this was a primary group, it would be that nobody could take your place and only you can give, and it's just non-transferable. It would be if you left the group, it would be that I'm sure we would carry on and it would take on, but no one would be it's just non-transferable. That's just a given, and that's okay. Yeah,
my teacher, Gabriel Moran, who's written a lot on community, once said that one of the marks of the community is that if one person was missing, the fact they were missing would be noticed and would somehow diminish the group. That's why, as you suggested before, numbers are really important to community.
That's to highlight that quality that, there is a certain thing about being non-transferable. Also, I think in a primary group, there's a sense of personal fulfillment. It's where your deepest human needs are met in the relationship, and I guess I think that just happens. I think in my experience of community living, and I think I've had some stand out as very, very good, and some stand out that, things were more of a struggle. In the ones that were the most positive, they more or less happened. We were aware it was something beyond our control, that some of these elements were just present. There would be another one. There was also something about the freedom in relating. So I think those four qualities were present in those primary groups, and that we've also gone another way, that many times before we form a group, we will talk out our expectations. And I'm happy to say that that doesn't work either, because you can talk out your expectations, and we can speak the same language and talk about what our expectations are and how we relate, and yet we many times use the same word, but it means something different. So I think that's coming close and trying to form community, and I'm saying I think that that's good, but I'm sort of playing or putting maybe a stronger emphasis on the fact that these things just happen. Those primary groups are that where I would call the true essence of community. There are certain qualities that are there, but they more or less, they happen. It's something like friendship, and it's something like love.
Right.
And
Well, I mean, I agree with that. And let's stay with that point for a while. I mean, I might put it in these terms, that community directly sought probably will vanish. In other words, if all of your energy is, let's get together and form a community, it could well not happen. It doesn't seem as though it's the right way to happen. It's like, let's get together and be friends, or let's make love happen in this relationship. The great realities seem to come as byproducts of something else. But, I mean, then we'd have to ask ourselves, though, but what is the something else that is happening here? I mean, how is it that this community is going to develop? You said it comes sort of as gift, and I suppose in our Christian understanding, again, we'd say, well, this is the grace of God, or this is the work of the Spirit, that God creates communities, and that we benefit from them, or we acknowledge them. They're sort of here, and our best response is to say, thank you, Lord, that we've got this kind of relationship. But on the other hand, I mean, don't communities happen because, say, we all have the same relationship to a religious value or to the Lord? I mean, if people come together and say, well, we're all Christians and we really want to be closer to Christ, and therefore we're going to read the Scriptures together once a week and talk about it, and boy, we get a lot of good communications going, dialogue, a lot of challenge and support for one another, and out of that, suddenly, after we've done this for 6 months, we begin to feel, well, we're a community.
I guess I would nuance that and call that a faith community.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think that's why it's not all so difficult, and I think, or it is difficult, because I think we have to have it clear as to what are we really looking for, and that type of thing can happen in, I think, a faith community. The thing that seems to be in common there is our desire for the Scriptures, and that, that's unspoken. Somehow that happened, and it's unspoken, and it's the desire for understanding the Scriptures. But now if we took that given group who relates as a faith community, and let's say we asked them to relate in a different context, I would suspect that it would not be the same level of sharing and experience. For example, let's say if we took that group and asked them to go on vacation together, it would be real interesting, and I think it can happen that a group like that could go on vacation together.
They might never want to meet again for their Scripture
that's
study.
Right, and it may bring some difficulty to that.
That's right.
It could happen that they could enjoy it. It could also happen that because that specifically sounds like a faith community to me. It might not be a community that knows how to relax together or have fun together.
No, that would raise it. I mean, suppose you got guys who play golf together every week. They might even play golf together twice a week or something. Then they have a beer afterwards and they talk it over. And maybe within that group sometimes the conversation gets serious, and they talk a little bit about how to raise their kids, and they share some of their grief over the way their kids are going, or some of their fears that they're going to be involved in ways they don't like, and so on. I mean, I can imagine that moving in this direction of community. I mean, you might not look at them and say, oh, those guys form a community, but they begin to take on characteristics that we're talking about here: communication, mutuality, sharing, and shared values. In other words, I don't know that the faith dimension has to be explicit to make it happen. And they're not going to get around after the golf game and take the Bible out and read a passage and talk about it, but they may well talk about what's really important in life and be sharing their deeper convictions about things and their own struggles and joys. And it would seem to me they at least move towards this notion of what community is. And in fact, it could be that when they're in trouble or need help, it's precisely those guys they play golf with that they call up on the phone and say, hey, I need advice, or could I borrow your car, or we need help for a while or something. You see, I mean, I think that it would begin to take on this and you could even say there's intimacy there at that level.
Yeah, that's a good example, and I think that, it does move toward. I mean, the common thing was golf that brought them together, right? And the golf, and we had fun, and we're all at this, and we're competing and all that, and then it starts moving in a different direction. And I would suspect that, let's say, if there were 10 guys that got together as a golf group, then there would, maybe 2 and 3 would gather and talk about their kids.
Yeah, that's
maybe
right, yeah.
maybe 2 and 3 would gather and talk about their business, and another. But yet,
and not everyone would be comfortable with the deeper conversation, probably.
Right, especially if some men golfing, I guess.
Well, that gets to be the question of intimacy in men and women.
Right.
I mean, whether there's women have a greater need to share, or do more sharing, or grow up learning how to discuss their deeper feelings and so on, and have more of these primary kind of community experiences than men do. I mean, I do think you're right that in the culture that's true. I mean, I think more women, if you took a poll, are going to say they've had experiences of community than you're going to find with men. However, I think that, I probably chose my example on purpose because I do think it's possible to have it grow out of the kind of experiences that men often share in our world today. And it might take on a little different character, but I wouldn't want to rule it out as being somehow intimate or having that characteristic
and
of
I agree with
intimacy.
You. I think I know of some men groups that are that way, so I'm saying it is possible.
Possibly, yeah. What about your question of expectation? I was trying to still unravel some of the points you made earlier before we move on. I thought that was a very important point you made, that there has to be some understanding of what we expect out of this grouping of people. Why are we coming to it, or why do we continue to get together? And your point was that you need to say it, but then maybe even after you say it, it doesn't solve all the problems. And you're talking out of experience and at that level, right?
I've just found that, we have all kinds of expectations, and not until the time that we get together to talk about them, maybe they're not even known to us, and that someone may have the expectation that they are going to form a friendship in this group. And, that might not well work out. So the harder you try at that expectation, it's your point earlier to try and force it. That person probably is going to go away with, an unfulfilled expectation. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but the fact that it is an expectation, there are things there that I don't think that we have the power to always fulfill all our expectations, given the grouping of people.
Right. I mean, what if they're very different? I mean, one person wants a great deal of intimacy and closeness, and the other person wants it to be more like a task-oriented group. We're supposed to get things done. I mean, there you're going to have big problems.
My litmus test for a group is to talk about, shall we have a real Christmas tree or an artificial tree? And when that begins surfaces what the expectation of the group are. In my own experience, that has always highlighted either and it's always, as in putting up the Christmas tree, it's always something. Now I understand why people sometimes get divorced over the Christmas tree. I mean, that's sort of a funny example, but it highlights the thing about expectations. I've lived with people that, Christmas will not be Christmas unless there is a real tree. And then that's symbolic of deeper levels.
Yeah.
So it's just that whole idea. I think it's good to sort of maybe know what one's expectations are. In the psychological level, sometimes I think that there is such psychological damage, and it's our own personal journey, that many times we have the closeness and we think that someone can fulfill that, where in reality that's never possible. So if I come in with the expectation that, you in this community are going to fulfill all my needs on a psychological level, I'm really setting myself up for a lot of trouble.
Community will never work at that level, will
Right.
it? I mean, it just is impossible because it violates human nature. I mean, you always got to get back to human nature, and this human nature is social, and we desire relationships, and we find our identity as people feed it back to us. But on the other hand, they're also limited. I mean, there are no perfect respondents, and there's no perfect community members, and it seems really important to have that clear when we get underway. But I'm trying to figure out, what are you going to do if people's expectations are way out of line? I suppose a couple things are going to happen. One is people are going to break up and go into different communities where they're going to find those expectations met. I mean, maybe the guy who really likes to talk about serious matters finds another group of golfing partners who are more like that and more family-oriented and, don't want to stay out drinking in long hours. They want to go home, but they also want to talk about life and its struggles and its joys and so on. So he finds people like that. So one thing that will happen is you'll find different community members or different people to relate to. The other thing that could happen, it seems to me, is that you'd compromise. So you'd say, you'd rein in your desires a little bit and say, I'd like to have more sharing here, but it isn't going to happen, and that's fine. I'll do that some other grouping that I'm in, and I'll make the most of it here. I think there's something psychologically sound about that, of saying, I'll do the best. I'll take people as they are, and I'm not going to force it or try to make more happen than really is possible.
Right, that acceptance factor.
It's a major point, isn't it? Acceptance, if we're going to make the community work.
Mm-hmm.
And that probably means that I would accept the fact that you're different and that you've got a different set of expectations and you have a different set of things to contribute to all of this. And I'm not going to force you really to contribute in the way I want you to, but I'll let you be a member of the group according to your own style, your own personality, your own background, and so on. Well, we're talking here a little bit about community, Geraldine. You raised so many ideas, it's hard for me to separate them all out or keep them all straight here. What you raised the question of numbers. I mean, are we going to be able to have a community with 500 people, like like some of our parishes, or 2,000 families? I mean, I would think not. I mean, I think that you got to have a sort of a manageable number before you're going to be able to say this functions as a community.
Well, if we're talking about a parish community, a church community, a congregation, a synagogue, a temple, whatever, I think we still come together as a community. And again, it's like, what are our expectations of this group? What's drawing us together? Whether it's the church, the synagogue, there's something there of some spiritual nature that's calling us together. So it refers to those different groups, and I think in regard to numbers, that's where we start distinguishing what type of group it is. There are certain, for example, a living number. In community life, we used to live with as many as 12 to 20. I don't know how much community life we had at that point in time. We all did the same thing. Now, I don't know what resulted in terms of community. We called ourselves community. At this point in time, most of us live in twos and threes. That's almost a little more difficult because you face people more directly. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of the support groups you mentioned many times, the AA groups, just the various group, and that numbers is an important consideration.
Okay, Geraldine, we've been talking about community. I would be hard-pressed to summarize what we've been talking about. We tried to talk a little bit about intimacy and the importance of expectations in our community life. And I suppose, if from a Christian perspective, what we'd like to say is that as we come together and respect one another and care for one another, some good things can happen. And we often describe that good thing as community. And finally, for us, we believe that's God's gift to us and one that ought to be treasured.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talked with Sister Geraldine Nowak, a pastoral associate at St. Ignatius Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was community life, intimacy, and expectation. If you have any comments on this week's show or suggestions for future programs, please write. Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.